Hello BookTube, my name is Carrie and today I'm doing part 2 of my June wrap-up. So let's go ahead and get started with my reading statistics for the second half of June. So first I read 9 books. Of those 9 books, 2 were anthologies. I read 2 YA contemporaries, 1 YA paranormal, 1 nonfiction history, 1 adult romance, 1 nonfiction gender and sexuality / memoir, and 1 adult fantasy. Of those 9 books, 4 were audiobooks, 4 were physical copies, 3 of which I owned and 1 that was a library loan, and 1 was an ebook. And my average rating for the entire month of June was a 3.6 stars, which I believe is my lowest so far in 2022. Now on to the actual books. The first is an anthology, which is The Newlywed's Window, edited by Mukana Press. This is an anthology that is filled with a wide variety of authors writing across different genres who are from various African countries, and this really challenges the reader to question, what do you expect from African voices? This is a really interesting collection because most of the stories fall into the genre of either literary fiction or horror / potentially thrillers, and they're actually not interconnected with one another. But I do feel like there is this bond across these stories of great writing, sharp social commentary, really vivid imagery. And I think that this collection as a whole really begs the reader to consider, who is the master of the short story? How can so many forms work so well together in this collection? Because I do think it's interesting how different authors really play around with style and form. Overall, I enjoyed the majority of the stories in this collection. I think this provides a great variety for readers of all types because there are different genres represented, but also a variety of character experiences and different themes and topics examined. I definitely look forward to following along with some of the new authors that I discovered in this collection and seeing where their careers grow. Also, this was an e-arc that was provided to me via NetGalley by Mukana Press, so thank you to them for providing this in exchange for an honest review. Yeah, I ended up rating it a 4 out of 5 stars. Next, I have Blackout, which is another anthology that was edited by Dhonielle Clayton, and I actually listened to this one on audiobook, and the narrators were Joniece Abbott-Pratt, Dion Graham, Imani Parks, Bahni Turpin, Jordan Cobb, Shayna Small, and AJ Beckles. And I have to say that I did really enjoy this via audio, but this was the first time that I've ever had an issue with Bahni Turpin's narration because the story that she's narrating, a character is, I believe, Jamaican American, and they have an accent, but it is mentioned in the story that the accent is barely noticeable, and yet in the audiobook, Bahni Turpin gives her a strong Jamaican accent, but then there are times when it like changes to an American accent, and it was just a very odd narration style. This is a collection of interconnected short stories, so all of these characters are coming together for this block party that is happening during a citywide blackout. And I've kind of gone back and forth about talking about this one because on the one hand, I think that each of these stories need to be examined on their own, but also as a collection because they are supposed to be tying together. But on the other, going through each story, I feel like I'm gonna ramble way too much with that. So I'm just gonna briefly say that I don't think that the interconnectivity of these stories really did anything for them. There were very weak connections between characters outside of this block party, even though like sometimes we hear characters, their family members are living in like the same like nursing home, or they go to the same high school or are in the same like circles just outside of school. So it was very odd to me that so many of these stories felt so distanced from one another. I think especially with the final story of this collection, it was so underwhelming because it just doesn't like put together the rest of the pieces that we were left with. Overall, some of the stories in this, I really love the characters, the writing, or like the idea behind it, but the actual execution of it just wasn't that great. And I think also some stories just felt really underdeveloped for me. And so this was one where I had like a mixed bag. There were a few short stories that I really liked, one that I really loved, and then there were a couple that I just really could not get on with. So I ended up rating this one a 3 out of 5 stars. Next, I listened to the audiobook of Punching the Air by Zoboi and Yusef Salaam, which was narrated by Herisse. This was an amazing audiobook. I would highly recommend that you pick this up on audio because the book is actually a novel in verse and the audiobook narrator narrates it almost like a spoken word poetry. It has such a rhythm and a cadence to it that just works so well with this story. This is a story of a teenage Muslim black boy who is wrongfully imprisoned for a crime that he did not commit. This story was certainly a poignant read, especially considering the significance of the author Yusef Salaam, who is one of the exonerated 5. And I'm not gonna lie, this was difficult to read at times, But something that I really loved in this is the writing style. There was so much vulnerability, reflection, and emotion poured into this story. And I love how this story didn't necessarily focus on how traumatizing this event was. Of course, that is a part of this story, but a much bigger focus of this is on Amal still finding a place for himself, finding things that bring him comfort and security, whether that be through his religion or through his art. There is still this sense of hope in this story, which I think is a really amazing part of this book. I think for some readers that might seem a bit too idealistic to include in a story like this, but I liked seeing this perspective in this story. We don't get a lot of stories like this about incarceration, and that it has a more positive message than some other books with similar subject matter. Now, initially I rated this story 4 to 5 stars, but this is one that since I have finished it, there's so much that I still keep thinking about it. And also it's one that I've talked with like a lot of people about since reading it. So I honestly am going to bump it up to 5 stars because I think this is a book that is very much going to stick with me. While I had some problems with the like authenticity in terms of scenes that were dialogue exchanges, that was my only minor complaint. Having now had time to think on this and reflect on it, reanalyze different parts of it, I do think that that is just not as important to me as how much I've taken away from this book. So yeah, 5 out of 5 stars. Would highly recommend this one, especially on audio. Next, I read Cemetery Boys by Aiden Thomas. This was a book club pick for a fantasy book club that I'm in, and I'm so glad that I picked this one up because oh my gosh, I loved this. This is the story of a teenage boy named Yadriel who is trying to prove himself to his family because he is a trans man who is from a Latinx family, and they're really struggling to accept and adjust to this transition. So because his family is a part of this Brujex, which is not actually witches, the Brujas are more like healers, and then the Brujos help ghosts kind of pass on into the afterlife. Yadriel decides he's going to prove himself by calling the spirit of his cousin who has just been murdered to try and figure out what happened to the cousin. Except when he does the ceremony, he ends up summoning the wrong ghost, and it's actually a boy that went to his high school named Julian. Julian is like, what's going on? What happened to me? Because he can't remember how or when he died. So Yadriel agrees to help him out while still trying to figure out what happened to his murdered cousin. I loved all of these characters, especially Yadriel and Julian. I think that they were just so well developed. They felt like they had individual personalities and voices in the story, and I really loved that. Also, there is a lot of inclusion of Latinx culture. There is a lot of distinction in this between different Latinx communities, and I loved how that was integrated into the story and this mythology surrounding the Lady of Death in this. There was a really great writing style. I will say that the big reveal in this, I did guess pretty early on, but I still liked how it unfolded, and there were still like little surprises in there. I still absolutely loved this. I gave it 5 out of 5 stars. It's definitely on my favorites. I really look forward to reading more of Aiden Thomas's work. Next, I listened to the audiobook of On Juneteenth by Annette Gordon-Reed, and this was narrated by the author. I would like to first discuss the mismarketing of this book. I don't know if this was the author's decision or if it was the publisher's decision, but I think the title of this book is purposely misleading because this is not a history of Juneteenth. This is very much a history of Texas, which was still a very interesting subject matter. Like, I still enjoyed reading about that, but I do find it very odd that this book is so heavily promoted as a book talking about the history of Juneteenth, because that is such a minuscule part of this story that I don't really agree with that marketing strategy. On to the actual content of the book. So I actually really found this interesting. I think it was really great how the author structured this. You can definitely tell that she comes from a historian background because she did a really great job of including context, dates, and certain historical figures to really help you follow through this story. It was organized so well, and she definitely veered away from info dumping. I also liked her candidness about the personal stories she included because there are a lot of personal anecdotes. There were some stories that I didn't really feel like needed to be included in this, and I didn't really understand how some of those personal anecdotes were tying into like her larger argument in some of the sections. However, there were other times where there were these personal experiences of the author or her family when they experienced racism, discrimination, and oppression, how those examples were used to showcase the very real and recent effects of these things that a lot of times we think are so far back in history, but they're really not. Overall, I wasn't going into this book expecting it to be a history of Texas, so that really missed the mark for me and did affect to an extent, my enjoyment of it. I do still think that this is a very interesting history of Texas, specifically looking at the history of non-white people in Texas. While the majority of this story is definitely focused on Black Texans, there are also sections talking about indigenous peoples and also Mexican people, because if you're unaware with the history of Texas, Texas used to be a part of Mexico. So there's discussion about that population and its history in Texas as well. If you're going into this expecting this to be solely focused on Juneteenth, I would definitely give this one a pass because it's, again, a very minimal part of this story. I ended up rating it a 3 out of 5 stars. Next, I read The Sweetest Remedy by Jane Igharo. This is a contemporary romance that is about a woman named Hannah who, at the beginning of this story, her estranged father has just died in Nigeria, and she is traveling there to meet her father's family for the first time because she was the result of an affair that her father had in the United States. I've heard this often discussed as a romance, and I don't fully agree with that categorization. There is a romance element to this story, but it very much takes a backseat and is much more focused on this contemporary exploration of this family in the aftermath of this big revelation and this father's death. So I would not enter this if you're expecting just like a light summer romance novel, because it is a much heavier read. So my favorite thing about this story is quite simply Hannah. I loved her as a main character. I think it was so interesting seeing how she was processing all of these things, and also these explorations that we get of her own identity, and also her kind of trying to contextualize who her father was to her, but also obviously to her siblings and his other family. It was an amazing decision by the author to use this multi-POV narration style so that we get familiar with all of the siblings, and I do feel like the different siblings felt unique and like they had individual voices in the story. It didn't feel like the same writing for each character, which is reflective of Jane Igharo's writing talent. She did such a great job of showing the different ways that people grieve, different communication styles, and also just different mindsets in this. The characters were really well rounded. Again, we got to see a lot of their personalities because of the shift in style, but also even like secondary characters still felt very developed. However, I do think there needed to be a little bit more development on the relationships between the siblings instead of just like them as individuals, because sometimes these relationships that were being built up between Hannah and her siblings felt so rushed and just kind of out of nowhere. So I would have liked to see more time given to that development. The romance between Hannah and Lawrence in this story felt very insta-lovey to me. I didn't really care for their storyline as a couple. While there were cute moments between them, I didn't fully believe that they had anything really in common or any pull to one another besides just sexual attraction, and it wasn't really enough for me to be invested in them. There is another relationship in this that I was really shocked none of the reviews talked about this. There is a very taboo age gap relationship that I think definitely borders on grooming in this, and it is never addressed. There is no discussion about the fact that this character was very much a mentor, parental figure, very much a part of their life since childhood, and that was so disturbing to me. I really didn't understand why that felt necessary to the story if it wasn't going to be addressed. It was just so creepy. Overall, this was an enjoyable and fast-paced read. I just really didn't care for the romance aspects of this story, so I ended up giving it a 3 out of 5 stars. Next, I read I Kissed Shara Wheeler by Casey McQuiston. This is a YA contemporary about a girl named Chloe who, 4 years before the events of this book, she and her 2 moms moved from California to Alabama to help take care of a family member that was sick, and ends up staying in Alabama for the long term after this. Chloe attends this private Christian academy that is an elite prep school in her area, and she is one of few openly out LGBTQ plus people in her high school. She identifies as bisexual. She has kind of pushed back at her feelings of not fitting in by constantly being the overachiever, fighting for valedictorian, and her only real competition is this girl Shara, who is beloved by the entire town. She can do no wrong, and she's the principal's daughter, she's dating the quarterback, was accepted into Harvard, and all these amazing things. Chloe calls bullshit. She thinks that Shara cannot be this great of a person, and then one day Shara randomly kisses Chloe and disappears. Chloe decides she has to figure out what was going on with Shara. Where is she? And she ends up finding out that Shara left these letters for Chloe this guy who lived next to Shara, Rory, and then her boyfriend, Smith. This was a book club pick for a YA book club that I'm a part of, and I really enjoyed this one, but I didn't fully love it. I think that this felt so much like an authentically teenage story, not like someone pretending to relate to teenagers, so I did really like that aspect. I loved the wide cast of characters we meet in this. Neither Chloe or Shara are really that likable, but the side characters are amazing. I loved so many of them. Also, the characters in general just receive a lot of really great development in this. I also love that there is this pushing back at stereotyping of the American South, and there is this really amazing monologue that one of the characters gives talking about how people's perception of the South is so problematic and so condescending. I really liked how this was interwoven into the story because it felt much more like a reality check for one of our characters than trying to get a soapbox moment, if that makes sense. In general, there are some amazing conversations in this book around sexuality and identity, and I'm really glad that this is available for YA audiences, but I also feel like there's a lot that older audiences could take away from this as well. In my book club, for example, there were people from like more my generation, there were people younger than me, there were people way older than me, and it was really interesting seeing how across different age ranges and different people just in general, this story really resonated with so many of us. However, I had some really big issues with the pacing and plot of this one. I do feel that about halfway through this story, the author just completely lost the plot line. All of a sudden, we were jumping way ahead, and they felt like very odd times to rush the story through. After a certain point, there's just not a lot happening, and it's not really clear why the story is still going on. I think I had about 100 pages left of this book, and I was just kind of like, why is this book so long? Because we had rushed past events that I found interesting and then nothing was really happening. And so I was like, okay, where are we going with this? What is even the plot at this point? Also, a big issue I had with those last 100 pages is that there are a couple of these scenes that just feel so contrived and very much like they're drawing the story out, and I don't think it needed that. So I ended up rating this a 4 out of 5 stars. Next, I listened to the audiobook of The Gender Games by Juno Dawson. This is a nonfiction book that is part memoir where Juno Dawson is discussing her life pre and post transition, and also it's part exploration of how gender really plays a role in society that we're not always fully aware of, and kind of the problematic aspects of heavily gendered societies. I really enjoyed this memoir. I think that this was such an interesting perspective that Juno Dawson presents in talking about these really heavy issues, but also interweaving personal experience so that they don't feel distanced from the reader. They feel still very personal. I also liked that in this, the author is really questioning the reader. How can you make changes? How can you do things differently? Because it's not on trans men and trans women to fix the entirety of society. And I really like that focus is definitely pushed on the reader of Juno Dawson saying, I've already done the work for myself. That's the end of my part. Now it's on you to figure out how you're gonna process this information and what changes you're gonna make. I also find this really fascinating because Juno Dawson talks a lot about the UK healthcare system in relation to not only LGBTQ plus healthcare, but also more specifically trans healthcare. And I'm someone who is definitely not familiar with the US system in regards to trans healthcare. I know that we have had a lot of issues in the United States with insurance companies denying proper care to trans people, with certain states wanting to limit the healthcare available to trans people. So that's something I definitely need to educate myself more on. I do think this is a very insightful book. There are parts of it that feel a bit dated now, just with references to certain events and also certain people that I kind of question if the author would have wanted to include had she known how some of these people have come out as like TERFs and things now, because this book I believe was written in 2017, maybe 2016. So that is something to maybe consider if you're going into this, that there are some aspects that are going to feel just a tiny bit dated. Overall, I rated it a 4 out of 5 stars. The final book for July, I actually have an entire video review of, and that is The Jasmine Throne by Tasha Suri. I really enjoyed this one, but I had so many complicated thoughts about this book. So like I said, I ended up doing a full video review. So yeah, please check that out if you're interested in hearing more about that. Overall, I gave it a 4 out of 5 stars. So that concludes all of the books that I read in the second half of June. If you've read any of these books or have any questions about these books, please let me know in the comments down below. I would love to talk more about them. And I hope that you enjoyed this video. Thank you so much for watching and happy reading. Bye.